In 1884, a group of European men sat around a table in Berlin and spent a few months drawing lines on a map of Africa. They had never been to most of the places they were divided. Some of them had never set foot on a continent at all. And the decisions they made that winter are still shaping wars, poverty, and borders today, over 140 years later. So how did something like that happen, and why did nobody stop them? Most people think Europe divided Africa because of greed. And yes, greed was a big part of it. But that is actually the surface level answer. The real reason goes much deeper. It involves a competition that was getting so dangerous that Europe was genuinely scared it might tear itself apart. Africa was not just a prize, it was a pressure valve. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why the scramble for Africa happened, who was actually behind it, what went down in that room in Berlin, and why the borders they drew that day created problems that African countries are still trying to fix right now. And stay with me until the end, because there is one detail about what happened inside that Berlin conference room that most people never get taught in school. It changes how you see the whole thing. Let me take you back to 1876. There is a man named King Leopold II of Belgium. Small country, not much power on the world stage. And Leopold is obsessed, genuinely, almost pathologically obsessed with the idea of owning a colony. He watches Britain and France get rich off their territories around the world, and he wants in. But Belgium is not interested. The Belgian government tells him, no, we do not want a colony. It is too expensive, too complicated. So Leopold decides to go around them. He sets up something called the International Association of the Congo. He tells the world it is a humanitarian project. He wants to bring civilization and free trade to Central Africa. He hires explorers. He gets backing from other powerful people. He frames himself as a philanthropist. It is one of the most successful lies in history. Because what Leopold actually wanted and what he eventually got was to personally own the Congo. Not Belgium, him, personally. An entire country the size of Western Europe, owned by one man, run like a private business built on forced labor and terror. But here is the thing. While Leopold was scheming his way into the Congo, other European powers were watching, and they started getting nervous. France was expanding in West Africa. Britain was pushing into East Africa and Southern Africa. Portugal had been there for centuries. Germany, newly unified and hungry for power, was moving fast. Everyone was grabbing, and nobody had rules. By the early 1880s, the situation was getting tense. European powers were bumping into each other. There were overlapping claims, arguments over territory, real risk of military conflict between countries that were already suspicious of each other back home in Europe. Someone had to call a meeting. That someone was Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, one of the most calculating political minds of the 19th century. In November 1884, Bismarck invited the major European powers to Berlin. Britain, France, Portugal, Belgium, Italy, Spain, and others all sent representatives. Even the United States showed up, though they had no colonies in Africa. Here is what was not at the table: a single African leader. Not one. The continent being divided had zero representation in the room where the decisions were made. Now, the conference had a few stated goals. They talked about free trade in the Congo Basin. They talked about ending the slave trade, which is almost darkly funny given what Leopold was about to do in the Congo. And they established something called the principle of effective occupation. This is the part that really mattered. Effective occupation meant that if a European power wanted to claim a piece of Africa, they could not just plant a flag and say it was theirs. They had to actually be there. They had to have a presence, a treaty with local leaders, or some form of administration on the ground. That sounds reasonable on the surface. But what it actually did was trigger a race. Every European country now had an incentive to move fast, get into Africa, sign treaties with local chiefs, build a presence, and lock in as much territory as possible before someone else did. The scramble went from a slow grab to a full sprint. And here is the part that still echoes today. The borders they drew, mostly in that Berlin conference room and in the years that followed, were drawn with rulers on maps. Straight lines, geometric shapes. They cut straight through mountains, rivers, forests, and most importantly, through people. Ethnic groups that had lived together for generations were split between two different colonies, sometimes between three. The Somali people ended up divided across 5 different territories: British Somaliland, Italian Somaliland, French Somaliland, Ethiopia, and the Northern Frontier District of Kenya. On the other side, groups that had been rivals or enemies for centuries, groups that spoke different languages, had different traditions, completely different ways of organizing society, were suddenly forced together under the same colonial flag. The Europeans did not care about any of that. They were drawing lines based on what was convenient for them. What made the map look clean? What settled disputes with each other? Africa was a puzzle they were solving for themselves. The people living there were not part of the equation. By 1914, just 30 years after the Berlin Conference, European powers controlled about 90% of the entire African continent. Only Ethiopia and Liberia remained independent. 90% in 30 years, that is how fast it happened. And that speed is part of why it was so destructive. There was no time for anything careful or considered. It was just grab, claim, move on. But the most damaging thing was not the speed. It was what those borders meant when colonial rule eventually ended. Here's the detail that most people miss. And this is the one that really hit me when I was researching this. When African countries started gaining independence in the 1950s and 1960s, they faced a choice. They could try to redraw the borders, go back to something that made more cultural and ethnic sense, or they could keep the colonial borders and try to build nations out of whatever the Europeans had handed them. They kept the borders. In 1963, the newly formed Organization of African Unity, which is now the African Union, made a decision to treat the colonial borders as permanent. They called it the principle of uti possidetis. The basic idea, whatever borders existed at independence, those stay. Nobody can renegotiate them. Why would they do that? Because the alternative was terrifying. If every country started redrawing borders based on ethnicity and culture, you would have dozens of wars happening all at once. There were too many overlapping claims, too many groups with grievances, too many ways it could spiral. The risk of total continental chaos was real. So they made a painful, pragmatic choice: keep the broken borders, build anyway. And that decision made by African leaders to manage the situation Europe created explains a lot of what has happened since. It explains why Nigeria, a country with over 250 distinct ethnic groups thrown together by British colonizers, has had repeated cycles of internal conflict. It explains why the Rwandan genocide of 1994 had roots in divisions that Belgian colonizers deliberately sharpened to make the territory easier to control. It explains why so many African civil wars have been fought along lines that only exist because of where a European official drew a line on a map in the 1880s. None of this means Africa's problems are purely the result of colonialism. That is too simple. African leaders made their own choices, good and bad, after independence. Corruption, poor governance, authoritarianism, these are real and they matter. But you cannot understand the starting conditions without understanding what those men in Berlin set in motion. They did not just divide land, they divided people. And they handed the consequences of that division to the people they had divided and then left. So why did Europe divide Africa? Because they were competing with each other and needed a release valve. Because one man's obsession with personal empire, Leopold in the Congo, lit a fire that everyone else felt they had to respond to. Because Bismarck needed a way to manage European tensions without a war breaking out at home. And because in the 1880s, there was nobody powerful enough to stop them. The Berlin Conference did not cause a scramble for Africa. The scramble was already happening. But it gave it rules. And those rules made it faster, more organized, and more total than it might have been otherwise. And the borders it produced, arbitrary, geometric, indifferent to the people living inside them, became the foundation that independent African nations had to build on. Some have built remarkably well despite that foundation. Others are still fighting wars that trace directly back to where a line was drawn 140 years ago. That is the real weight of what happened in Berlin in 1884. Not just a historical footnote, a set of consequences still being lived out right now. Subscribe.